As far as I know, most people in Africa are not familiar with Halloween. I once explained it to an ex girlfriend of mine, that time of year when people celebrate ghosts, and she almost slapped me the back off my skin because she thought I was screwing with her. In retrospect, I didn't properly explain the creepy holiday. Anyway, the point that most of my friends, family, relative, and associates don't know about Halloween. I'm from a country in southern Africa, and if I had to be honest, Halloween is not a big deal here. I am not going to disclose my name or my country because some of the stuff in this story is illegal, and I don't want any fan saying spending time in the big house again. I only know of Halloween because of many European and American horror movies I watch. Not to mention I'm a devoted person of internet sites like Reddit and Creepypasta. Even with my knowledge of it, I was never big on Halloween. Then all changed one year with certain circumstances which led me to move back with my parents. First, let me explain how this 35-year-old man ended up staying with his parents again. I was never formally employed. I did have shady deals around town which provided for my bread and butter. I was what most people refer to as a scammer or con man or con artist. Before you judge me, you should know that it wasn't my dream to a profession when I was a kid. My country's economy is not that good, and decent jobs are hard to come by. Anyway, one day, a deal went bad and it cost me my house, furniture, and cars, and this forced me to move back to my parents' home. I am not married and I don't have any kids that I know of, so my parents couldn't complain much because I wasn't bringing extra mouths to feed. One night in early October of last year, I was binge reading stories on the internet when I realized most of them were centered on Halloween. That was when it dawned on me that they were close to spooky holiday. A light bulb turned on my head and dollar signs rolled up in front of my eyes. I had an idea. This was going to get me paid big time, and I could feel it. I had to create a haunted house. I had the perfect house in mind, and the house next door had been vacant for years. When I was growing up, different families moved into that house but never stayed for long than a year. I never thought much of it, but I figured it must have been because of rent for the bills. My parents live in that occupant suburban neighborhood, and most people can't handle the cost of staying in that area. I knew the real estate agency which owns the house and security guards that watch over the place. I knew one of the guards. His name was George. He had dark skin and he was a rack, bald and scoot, with even a thick mustache. Whenever I got the chance, I always chatted with him for a few hours and he would pour his heart out to me. He would talk about his wife, his family, his job, his boss, and a bunch of other things I never cared about too much. I wasn't sure if he considered me as a friend, and I wanted to use this situation to gouge out the nature of our relationship. I approached George with the proposal of using the house for a haunted attraction for a few hours during his shift, and he was hesitant at first. However, as someone who had whined to me about his measly salary, he agreed after I had convinced him that this would be an opportunity for him to make some money on the side. He vehemently warned me that if he lost his job because of this, he would have my head. His job was usually boring as watching paint dry. He also offered me to help with the running of the haunted house, and this was music to my ears. I just needed one more person assistance, and John happened to be that guy. John was the thickest man who always had the same crew and cut hairstyle ever since I met him back in high school. I know he said he is the thickest, but if you say that to his face, he may drop you with a punch. He prefers to be called big boned. John is a really huge baby. He also lived with his parents, but he had a well-paying job as a baker at the local supermarket. He earned enough money to fend for himself, and I guess he still wanted his mother to do his laundry and his dad to check for monsters under his bed, which is why he's still residing with his childhood home. Anyway, John was also on board with helping out with the haunted house and even made posters to advertise the place. He had put them up all over the neighborhood. He had also brought discarded cookies and muffins from the bakery to which he suggested we should give it to the customers after they've gone through the haunted house. I love that idea because it really captured Halloween concept for trick or treat. Even though we were actually giving both trick or treat to our customers, it also meant we will also be charging the customers more, so I gave him double thumbs up on the idea. Next, I needed props to decorate my house. Since I was dead broke, I had to work with what was my disposal. My mother has a lot of bed sheets, to which I borrowed without her knowledge. My younger sister Ruth was a hoarder of dolls, and as she was a child, but she neglected all of her toys when she reached puberty. My dad still kept all of Ruth's dolls in the garage, so I also borrowed several of those heads without telling anyone about it. So when I finally had my props and team, I felt confident that this house scheme would be a success. When we went to the house to set it up for the first time, I was shocked with the deplorable state of place. I had ever gone inside the neighboring house before. Every time I spoke with George, it always felt outside the gate. The yard was choked up with the waist-high brown grass, and the windows were caked with dust, and the 7-foot-tall Dora was a wall that was mantled with green vines that went through the front iron gate, enough for us to get the tetanus just by looking at it. The house was a typical suburban home painted with white with sloppy blue roof. It had 3 bedrooms, a toilet, a kitchen, a lounge, and a dining room, and a little bit of furniture in it that was decrepit and filled with either dust or cobwebs. The place was already creepy, requiring minimal effort for our behalf. George told us that the house had an electrical problem, so it didn't have power. His bosses had sworn to get the problem fixed, but they hadn't done anything about it yet. We didn't mind because the lack of power served our purpose as well. It took us half the day to set everything up we needed. Our target audience was kids, preferably, below 13, and since they weren't that hard to scare, we didn't go full psycho on the decorations. So the rundown of the haunted house was pretty simple. As soon as our customers arrive, the front of the gate will appear to have swung open by itself, but in reality, it was being pulled by George using a wire. He should be hiding it deep in the thicket of the brown grass in the yard. The customers would be met with a small wooden table and a glass jar above labeled "Feed Me." That's when they'll pay their admission fee. If they pay, George's supposed to play a recording of witches laughing from his phone. If they didn't pay, George was supposed to be playing a recording of barking dogs. George and I would be inside the house. If we heard the sound of laughing of witches from George's phone, we would get into our positions. If we heard the sound of dogs barking, it meant the approaching customers hadn't paid, so we would lock the front door. We were not going to go entertain broke kids. This was a business, an illegal one. Sure, but it was nonetheless. Anyway, after payment, the customers would follow the concrete pavement leading up to the front door. The pavement was smeared with ketchup, and also I borrowed from home without telling anyone. My mother became suspicious on how the ketchup was finishing up so quickly, and since my father really loved that stuff, she considered him the biggest culprit. I kept my mouth zipped. The walkways had been flanked with tall brown grass where we planted the dolls' heads on sticks. The customers will walk down the pavement and the center through the front door, to which it led to a spacious lounge where dead lizards were hanging on strings, will dangle down from the ceiling. George provided us with the dead lizards. I have no idea why he had them or where he got them, and frankly, I didn't want to know. The loud wailing of the baby then will arrest the attention of the customers, and they will follow the butcher knife, and this meant to chase the customers out of the room. John would be the closet playing the recording of the baby crying on his phone. He would also be the one pulling the strings on the doll to walk and make threatening gestures with its arms. This particular doll was spine-tingling to look at, even for me. I have no idea why my sister kept this thing as a child. It looked like Chucky understudy because of the shiny porcelain, but the nefarious smile on its scarred face, and as long as a bedraggled orange hair. The customers will then proceed to use the main bedroom where I will be. We call it the room the White Room. All the room's furniture was compressed with small, rickety table, a wooden rocking chair, and a large fitted-in bookshelf. All this furniture were shrouded with white bed sheets would also be choked by the white bed sheet by standing next to the bookshelf, waiting for the customers to enter. The bedsheet was often used long enough to cover my whole body, including my feet. I was always concerned that one day I would trip over myself, not only fall, but shamefully reveal myself to the customers. Thankfully, it never happened. When the customers entered my room, I was supposed to run at them and chase them out of the house. When they reached the gate, they would find the admission fee jar gone in its place, and there would be a plate with either a muffin or a cookie. Not a bad haunted house for guys with $0 budget, huh? Business bloomed within the first week. John marketed our haunted house well. His posters were quite alluring. I had warned him to only advertise in our neighborhood. We didn't want George's boss finding out about this and getting us arrested. John even spread rumors about the old inhabitants of the house, where Satanists used to sacrifice children for their fortune and fame. The news spread like wildfire and brought us a lot of customers, since our suburban neighborhood was extremely boring. People were always eager to jump at anything that entertains them. At first, mostly younger kids were our best customers, but eventually teenagers and adults soon took an interest in our haunted house. George's shift usually started late afternoon, and John was finished work by midday, so we would open the haunted house at 4 o'clock and close around 7 p.m. For 2 amazing weeks, we made great money, which we split 3 ways. I was having time of my life, and I was thinking about milking this cow until it ran dry. I wanted to run this business until the end of the year. However, one fateful night forced us to retire early from this dream job we didn't know we wanted. It was 2 days before Halloween, and it was almost closing time. It was already dark, and we had agreed to do one more act before we call it a day. We heard girls giggling from the hallway, and a guy's voice said, "Oh my, that's scary." The sarcasm deep in his voice was all too vivid. The group of customers continued cackling as they made their way into my room. I heard one of them complaining of how this was a waste of money. They reached for my room and stood by the door. The bedsheet featuring me was pure silk, so I was able to see through it. The glimmer of the moon splitting through the barren windows was enough for me to confirm that I was already suspected. It was just only a group of teenagers. The teenagers were problematic for a lot of reasons. Most of the time they didn't want to pay. They were barely scared with our stunts. Some of them thought it was best to write on the walls, steal, or break something in the house before they left. The group was accompanied by 2 girls and 1 guy. One of the girls had dark skin, short hair, and hazel brown eyes. The other girl had long black braids, tied into a ponytail, light skin, and dark brown eyes. They were both wearing jean shorts and were grabbed by a pink and red tank tops, respectively. The guy was accompanying them was well-built kid with thick black afro hair. He wore blue skinny jeans and a gray t-shirt. "What's going on here?" the guy asked as the trio walked in the room. The girls snickered as they swaggered close to each other. "That's really innovative, dude. We can see you under that bedsheet," the guy said. I sat for the time being and made it out easily, but then I realized the teenager wasn't talking or looking at me. He was looking at the opposite side of where I was standing. In fact, all 3 of them were looking at that direction. I followed their gaze, and my heart stopped. A few feet to my right, there was someone seated on the rocking chair in the room. The figure had white bedsheet blanketing over its humanoid body. My mind raced to think who it could be, to consider a possibility of George or John coming into my act. The figure slowly stood up in the rocking chair. The sound of snapping and cracking bones resonated from underneath the bedsheet. The humanoid figure stood at the colossal height. It was about 8 feet tall and slim like a willow. Its shoes were sticking out from under the bedsheet. Its feet were facing sideways like how Charlie Chaplin used to stand. And just like Charlie Chaplin, its shoe size was ridiculously long. The shiny black leather toes, the shoes of the figure, looked like the shoes of a cartoon clown. All of a sudden, the figure began marching towards the teenagers. With every step it took, its Bugs Bunny-sized shoes pounded on the hard floor with force. The teenage girls wrapped their arms around each other and muffled behind the boy. "Hey man, we get it, you're a ghost. You scared the girls. But now you need to stop," said the teenage boy. Like a bouncer, it walked up to someone, causing problems in the bar, the figure striding with a malicious intent to it. The giant footsteps were rapidly decreasing, and the distance between it and the teenagers. "Okay, that's far enough, pal. Don't come any closer. I'm warning you. I have skills of combat," the boy yelled at the figure. But the figure was already upon them. The teenage boy swung a punch at the bedsheet, and it flapped to the ground, revealing no one underneath it. The leather shoes that revealed the size of duck's feet had also disappeared. My knees wriggled with a wave of uneasiness, jousted to my scrawny body, as I stared at the sheet lying flat on the floor. The teenager's faces were well balanced with fear. The vanity of the girls had disappeared, with the bravado of the boy that evaporated. They all screamed so loudly they didn't even realize I was also screaming with them. I began running towards the door, and the teenagers noticed me. They probably thought I was another apparition coming after them, and they bolted out of the room. They ran down the hallway and went out the front door with lightning speed. Before I exited out of the white room, I was dumb enough to turn back, and my heart jumped into my throat at what I saw. The humanoid body figure was erecting from below the bedsheet. It stood once more at abnormal height, and its inhumanly long toes and shoes had reappeared. I yanked the bedsheet to the floor and ran like the wind. I sped down the hallway and burst out the front door. I screamed for help from John or George, but I think I even yelled out for my mother in the process. George stopped me before I ran out of the gate. He asked me what was wrong. I was too petrified to even reply. I just pointed at the house. John came wobbling out of the house and asked the same question as George. After a couple of deep breaths, I tried to explain, but I was interrupted by a sound emanating from the house. It was the sound of a crying baby. "Did you leave your phone inside the house?" I asked John. He shook my body to the core. His reply was, "No, I have it with me." He even showed it to me. The sound of the baby crying became louder. It soon seemed like there was a crying baby in every room in the house. "What is happening?" George tremulously asked. No one replied to him, because we all noticed a cadaverous figure covered with a white bedsheet was right by the front door. Its protruded shoes were now hovering over the air as the figure floated a few inches above the ground. The sounds of crying children had reached the ear-shredding volumes. Some of crying seemed to have come from the dolls' heads sticking in the yard. My stomach was in knots when I noticed the globs of worms pouring out of the dolls' heads and mouths and ears. The figure then by the door stretched his arms like Jesus on the cross, and one by one the lights of each of the room switched on. My mouth was dry and agape when I saw the dead lizards hanging from the ceiling above every room in the house. "I don't remember pointing up all those lizards," I heard George mutter. The figure eventually lowered its arms, and all the lights simultaneously shut off. The front door was abruptly slammed shut in the front of the figure, and the crying ceased. That night, George stayed at our house. I forgot the explanation I gave my parents, but I guess it was the most believable one in truth. Up until now, I never had spoken to anyone besides George and John about that night. I tried convincing both of them that it was just a prank of some sort, but even I couldn't believe that. George had quit his job the very next day. He used the money we made from the haunted house to open a truck shop, or a barber shop or something. I told you we made good money. John also quit his job and became a paranormal investigator. He goes out of the country exploring, researching ghosts and haunted places. His team once went into the house next door with cameras and a bunch of ghost-busting equipment, but I never asked what they found. I already had seen enough. As soon as I moved out of my parents' house, I couldn't stand the sound of the baby crying, and I always heard it coming from the next door in the middle of the night. Now I have my own apartment on the east side of the country. I'm not that expert on Halloween, but I have a feeling it had something to do with whatever spirit that came after us that night. I had once asked George if something like that had previously happened at the house, and he said no. He even asked the other guards if they ever experienced that sort of stuff during their shifts. My reasoning for this: by celebrating Halloween, we may have invited or awoken something supernatural in that house. But I know that sounds crazy. But John contacted me the other day and he said, According to his nationwide research, more people in the country are celebrating Halloween this year. Based on the statistics, this year has now the most ghost sightings in the country's history.